Welcome to the Church Leadership Podcast, your weekly source for encouraging and equipping local church leaders, with your hosts, Mark Gainey and Andy Frazier. In each episode, Andy and Mark sit down with church leaders that you should know. We believe these honest conversations will be helpful and encouraging to you as you lead the local church. Here is this week's episode.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Church Leadership Podcast. We are thrilled that you are back for another episode and another conversation. And our mission here at the podcast is to encourage and equip you to lead in the local church. And we know that today's conversation is going to help do just that. Before we get to the conversation, though, I want to remind you to do a couple things. Go over and subscribe to this podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, it's really easy. Hit the subscribe button, hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single episode when it airs. If you're listening on your favorite podcast listening app, then you can subscribe right there in that app. We're on every app you can imagine, so we'd appreciate you do that. And by the way, you can always go over to our website, churchleadershippodcast.com, and check out the show notes for every episode. We've got more detailed show notes there and links, information you can find out about each of our guests, and resources and tools that are related to each conversation. So I want to remind you to do that as well. Now, here is today's conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on the podcast. We're glad you get to listen in on the conversation that we have with Will Mancini this week. We're glad Will has joined us. Will is a church consultant, a ministry entrepreneur, and he also is the founder of Future Church Company. And Will, we are glad you've taken time out of your schedule to join us on the podcast this week.
Yeah, Andy and Mark, it's great to be with you guys.
Well, we're going to jump right in to the conversation, and some of the folks watching and listening may have read your book, your most recent book, Future Church, and we want to kind of talk about really the premise behind that book and really your passion. And there's a quote that I want to I'm assuming it's attributed to you, so I want to use it and then use that to launch in our conversation. And here's the quote: "It's the paradigm for church we've embraced, that has arisen as a result of the last 40 years of church history in North America, is perfectly designed to produce the limited results we're getting. We can do better." And I cannot think of a better way to say it, because that is so true. What we've been doing is getting exactly what we've been getting. And if we want something different, then we've got to do better. And so talk about that, how you've discovered the fact that what we're doing, or what we have been doing the last 40 years, just especially post-COVID, just isn't going to cut it in the future of church.
Yeah, one way I think about it, there's never been more like ways of thinking about doing church. I mean, there's thousands of books on how to do church, and so many different faith tribes and their backgrounds and distinctives. And so what's really unique, I think, today is that we all share as church leaders a very common dynamic and challenge that we continue to articulate, kind of building on that opening, Mark, of this functional Great Commission seems to have crept its way in to just how we think in general. And I think every church leader, it's what's unique about this cultural moment is that no one really pushes back on this. We're all like, yep, that's where we are, and let's do something about it. But I like to summarize it as the functional Great Commission is become, go into all the world and make more worship attenders, baptizing them in the name of small groups and teaching them to volunteer a few hours a month. And it's like, wow, there's something about, church that's important, and those are important things, but it's not the whole thing. It's not what Jesus gave his life for. So right. I'm just amazed how that rings true. It just creates a hunger in church leaders to do something different.
That is so true. I mean, that statement, that functional Great Commission, you can't deny that. You cannot deny that is how we've been functioning. That's so perfect.
Yeah, we have a functional Savior in Jesus. We've made him into who we want him to be, and we have a functional Great Commission. I can't agree with you more.
Yeah.
So that philosophy of not just ministry, but that understanding of the Great Commission and the paradigm for us that we're in for church, and the failure we're experiencing of church, not just church closures and ministers who are dropping out of the ministry, but I mean, we're just failing at making disciples. That's led you to do some things, not just to be creative in ministry, but to really have a heart to help churches and pastors and church leaders. So Tell us a little bit about what you do, not just writing books, but tell us how you churches kind of regain our big picture of what we're supposed to be about.
Yeah. Well, I've, as you mentioned, I've been doing church consulting. I was a church planner and then turned church coach / consultant about 20 years ago. And I've, most people who've read my stuff or know of my ministry know it's about vision, clarity, that kind of thing. And what I think over time, you can put kind of vision, planning, strategy, and kind of an organizational kind of box. And every year as I've done the work, I've realized I don't want people to think of me as the vision guy over the disciple making guy. So, over the years, having a vision frame has always been for me about the core mission of disciple making. So over time, I wanted to be more clear about that. So I've, kind of changed up and kind of reset my consulting presence this last year around the Future Church Company. And that's really an ecosystem of tools and processes that really get packaged in 3 different brands or 3 different companies. So my consulting work directly to the church is called Church Pivot, or Pivot, and that that's bringing kind of the toolbox within the Future Church book to church teams across the country. So dealing with that problem we just articulated. I've also, about 7 years ago, I began R&D work in a life design, a gospel-centered life design toolbox that's really designed to deliver through the church. And we call that Life Unique. So we help churches basically install a process where people get trained to live out of their personal calling. And it's really beautiful to see, every day, men and women, believers in the church, kind of naming why God put them on earth and really seeing their 9 to 5, not just as a, point of, income, but as really a medium for disciple making. So really helping people, disciple where they live, work, and play, not just, invite someone into a group at church. In fact, I would say if Jesus was here today, making disciples and, in our cultural moment, it would look more like how he's making disciples as a banker, a plumber, a teacher, a counselor, more than just inviting them to kind of how we do groups at church. So that whole toolbox is really special to me, and we're taking about 5,000 people through that in the last That's 5 years, and working through about 200 or 300 churches, and churches are adding that toolbox every day right now. So it's really accelerating in post-COVID. And then the other organization that's part of the Future Church Company ecosystem, we have Pivot, we have Unique, and we have what we call Denominee, which is a toolbox for network leaders, denominational leaders, multi-church leaders, anyone who's working over a scope, whether you're a multi-church of 10 churches, a small church planning network of 40 or 50 churches, or, a denomination of 500, 5,000, or 50,000, we're helping kind of revitalize how we think about networking and denominations there. So anyhow, that's all those 3 things work together at the Future Church Company.
That's awesome. And I think it just goes right to your heartbeat of helping churches. And I love it. You're an entrepreneur and you have a passion to help churches, and you see a need and you meet it. And so we applaud you, Will, and we're thankful for those resources. We're going to put some information about each of those in the show notes as well for our listeners and watchers. I do want to drill down on something that we really started the conversation on, and that is, that functional Great Commission versus the one given. And so, you talk about it in your book, Future Church, but you're not talking about burning everything to the ground, right? You're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And you're not saying that all of us need to go to, micro churches and all that, but right. I think what you're saying is so needed. All right. What the message that you're helping churches understand from the Great Commission is such an urgent message right now. And so how do you, for leaders listening right now in churches, whether they're lay leaders or whether they're pastors, how would you encourage them to take steps to realign their church with what Jesus actually said?
Yeah, one helpful picture, Mark, that I would encourage church leaders to use, put it on a whiteboard, start conversations in the church. It has a powerful impact. It's a little napkin sketch that we build around the question, why do people call your church home? Mm-hmm. Or I like the question behind that of what emotionally connects people to your church. And we draw a little napkin sketch of a two-story home with a lower room and an upper room. And we put in the lower room, which is the common starting place for everyone. If someone walks in your church, they're going to notice things. They're going to see the physical place, whether you have a great looking sanctuary, you've done a, redo in a strip center, wherever your church happens to meet, people are going to connect to the place. There's personality. They're going to, have immediate kind of impression of you as a senior pastor or highly visible church leader, maybe a worship presence. So people will connect or not to the personality. There's programs, there's ways you're doing things in your programming. So the style, the choices that you're making programmatically, and whether it's a Tuesday morning women's Bible study or how we do kids ministry on Sunday, whatever that is, people will kind of have a connection to that. And then there's just, the people factor, like, you have a good vibe or not. And I like the folks I hang out with. I have friends who show up Sunday morning, other times. And so what we'd say is most church attenders have what we call a lower room identity, meaning their deepest connection is to some mix of, they like the place, they like the personality of the staff, they like the programming, they like the people who come. And here's the tension. We're like, well, who doesn't want to have great, lower room stuff? I mean, if I want every church leader listening to have a great place to meet, and I want their charisma to shine, and want the programs to work and bring value, want people to feel accepted and loved. And yet we would say if we're only in the lower room, if there's not a bigger idea that people can connect to, we may be missing something. And so we just talk about, hey, you have an opportunity as a leader to connect people in the upper room. And this is what's it's so basic, but so mind-blowing at the same time, Mark and Andy. Like, people really, like, everyday men and women really do want to be connected to a much more meaningful place, a more transcendent place. They want to be connected to the unique purpose and calling of a local family of believers. And that's, spend my life trying to help churches say, how do you name and articulate what that upper room is, and how do you connect people so that people are really excited about God's dream for that for the world in general, but specifically expressed in a local church. And just to quickly clarify two things on why this tool is so helpful. I mean, if you ask a 8-year-old boy, what does he want most in life? Every answer will be tangible, right? An electric scooter, an Xbox. And if you ask that 8-year-old boy's parents what they want most for their son, every answer will be intangible. We want him to know God. We want him to be loved and love, and we want him to have self-confidence, etc. So this lower room, upper room is everywhere in life, right? When we go back to Jesus's ministry, we can see lower room and upper room too. I mean, he's God on earth teaching probably 20,000 men, women, and children at the feeding of the 5,000 men. But literally, his church is about 120 in Acts 1. I mean, he gave his life over these 3 years of ministry to deeply invest in a few, and he built the movement of Christianity on a following of 120 people, not on these crowds. So it's a really beautiful picture, I think, of not just Jesus' pattern for ministry, but of a pathway for us. And rather than feeling frustrated that we might only have lower room disciples now and again, we go, wow, this is actually the pattern Jesus has. I've got a lower room in my programmatic expression of church who's showing up on Sunday. How many people are in the upper room? And how am I calling people into that upper room? And of course, there's a lot we do with that tool, as you can imagine, but that's a foundational tool. And what's beautiful about that, Mark and Andy, is you get that conversation going, whether you're a leader, a volunteer, an attender, you start hungering for that question of, what is God's story for us? What does our upper room look like right now? And it's a great conversation to get started.
I can second that. I have used that specific tool probably, I don't know, 100 times over the last 7 years. And you're right. It starts the conversation about what really matters. That's good.
Yeah. What you're talking about, Will, it may not, like Mark said earlier, it may not lead you to want to burn everything to the ground, but it definitely will lead you to prayerfully consider and reconsider the things you've been doing to get the results you're getting. I mean, what got us here won't get us where we need to be. And I'm guessing by establishing an organization called Future Church Company, that you have something in mind for the future of the church that hopefully looks more like what Jesus intended our church to look like, not where we are. And if you're going to evaluate your lower room and upper room and your strategy and philosophy of how you do things, how does that help us to kind of reprioritize the things that we need to prioritize, and maybe get rid of some things that we need to get rid of? Because I believe COVID has been a great way to expose some of the chinks in our armor and our weaknesses, and to let us see, like you mentioned earlier, this functional Great Commission, that if we overprogram our church and overpopulate our calendars, then we've created less and less margin for our people to actually go out and fulfill the Great Commission. So how do we evaluate that and maybe reprioritize or get ourselves back on track where we need to be to ultimately make our churches disciple-making churches?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I believe that we're at a place where we need to deal with our paradigm, or our perspective, in such a deep way that it's a little more disruptive. And I think COVID gives us that opportunity, or that awakening, as you're saying, to see it as a paradigm issue. So I think first, we've got to apply the lever in the right place. So what I would suggest is, we are talking way too much about cultural Christianity and consumerism. So that's always going to be out there, in terms of it's shifting right over time. But I would really encourage a church leader to put the lever bar somewhere else. And I would say the greatest limitation to our disciple-making results is our imagination as church leaders. And if we can reposition the problem as a problem of how we think, that's the starting point. And that's what I'm after with the 7 laws of real church growth that come out in Future Church. I'm trying to help church leaders look at it as an imagination idea. And so, we walk through those 7 laws, which I won't unpack all right now, but I'll throw one out there that maybe a little. Let me go throw 2 out there. Law 5 is the law of development. Real church growth is about growing people, not managing programs. And so that one is easy to receive. Let me just throw out one right after it that is a little bit more difficult, and just suggest as an imaginative thing what I'm referring to. The law 6 is the law of leadership, and we'd say that real church growth is led by calling, not celebrity. Now, what's important about that idea of celebrity is not that most pastors I've met, the thousands I've worked with, they don't get out of bed in the morning wanting fame. It's not about that. I mean, no one's called into ministry for that. But the way we do church in North America, you have a platform, whether you're preaching to 50, 150, or 500, doesn't matter. You have a platform, and you're an important God person to a community of people. And that by itself can backfire on the release and the activation of the everyday calling of the people that you minister to. So I like to, just think imaginatively about the fact that, let's say, celebrity, Mark and Andy, you guys are both, guys helping other church leaders. You're, well-known guys. And here's the deal, you can't give away part of your fame or your celebrity. And I'm talking, small f, small c. It's just that you can't give that away. By the way, Jesus was a celebrity too. Celebrity's not bad. Jesus was a celebrity. Well known. I mean, people coming from all over the place. He was a celebrity. He didn't rely on his celebrity. Here's what happens. The mission of Jesus moves forward through the presence of Jesus and the authority that transfers to everyday men and women who steward the power of the gospel. And it's just, the greatest power source on the planet. But what happens is we rely a little bit on our programmatic platforms, and we can't transmit the celebrity the same way we can transmit the authority through everyday calling of men and women. And what happens is we rely too much on the programmatic expression of what the church is doing, gathered around the influence of one hero who's that, bivocational, part-time, whatever, full-time staff person, rather than helping reposition the role of the staff as a hero maker, helping champion the calling of each individual person. I like to say this, a little dangerous. I like to declare the pastorhood of every believer. The priesthood of every believer exploded dynamite 500 years ago because we needed to say, you don't need a priest to have access to God. you have direct access to God, part of the Protestant Reformation. I think what we need in the 2021 Reformation of the church is to declare the pastor to every believer has a parish, has a sphere of influence, and the disciple making that we're all hungry for is going to be released at that point of where people live, work, and play. So, getting serious about individual calling to me is a big part of helping reimagine what church can look like in the future.
And that goes right in line with one of the parts of future church, and that's the unique aspect of it. I'm gonna be honest. I don't say this in most interviews, but I'm intrigued by that specific area of future church, and I'm gonna dive into that. So people listening, Will, you don't know this, but people listening know this probably, are watching. So I've got 4 kids. My oldest is going to get married in October, and my second oldest is going to college in the fall. So, I'm at that stage as a father. I'm like, man, my 2 oldest need to be a part of that very thing, because they need to discover earlier than I did, their calling, so they don't run from their calling like their father did. But we're coming kind of to the end here, and I'm going to do this a little bit differently than we normally do it. Normally we say, hey, what can you encourage our folks with? And I'm going to ask you to do that, because I guarantee you there's a pastor or a staff member watching, listening, that is intrigued as well, but is really probably impacted by your statement about functional Great Commission, and they know they need to get their church back to where they're supposed to be. But I want to ask you kind of a twofold question here, and I think they're both going to be the same. But your book is Future Church, your company's called Future Church, and we've talked around that. But I want to ask, post-COVID right now, how do you see the future of the church? What does it look like in the future? And maybe kind of piggybacking on that, how can you encourage those watching and listening to be a part of that future church?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think COVID was, as challenging as it was, it was a gift. Let me kind of clarify that. It was a gift of clarification, purging, revealing, where we are, because the COVID didn't really diminish anything about the mission of Jesus. So if it diminishes anything at church, it's a reflection of the gap between what we're doing and what the mission of Jesus is. In other words, it kicked our lower room around quite a bit, but it didn't touch the upper room, right. and nothing can ever touch Jesus's upper room. The one scriptural reflection on this, just really quickly, then a moment of hope, is Babel, actually. So Babel in Genesis 11 is really an act of grace in a similar way to COVID was, in the sense that people were stuck. Jesus, or God, in Genesis 1, the first commission was be fruitful and multiply, spread and fill the earth. And now these folks are all huddled together, building a tower to God in their pride and hubris. And so what God does is confuse the languages, which was actually a restorative thing to the first commission. In other words, we gotta spread out, guys. So I'm gonna help you spread out. And in a similar way, COVID kind of is like helping you recalibrate to the biggest idea of the church. And this is crazy. I mean, in John 6, verse 66, Jesus throws some hard teaching down. If you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can't have eternal life. And he's, of course, building off the statement, I am the bread of life, there in John 6. And Jesus creates his own COVID moment. I mean, the crowds just leave. It's like train wreck, right? It's like, no, it didn't bother Jesus that the crowds left, because he was building the future on a few. That's the moment of hope. Whether you have a core team of 5 people, 50 people, doesn't matter. Like, the future of the church for Jesus was found in a few that he invested in. The future of the church in 2021 is found in the few that you're investing in. So how well is your investment in the few? Now, we have our model of ministry, and we have bills to pay, and we have people coming and giving. So again, I love the organized expression of church. While you're doing the organized expression of church, the future of your church is still found in the few. How is your investment into a few people and their investment into a few people as really the chain reaction of what Jesus started that is continuing today everywhere? And you've got this, church leader, like, you can do that. So it's just a refreshment of actually how accessible the mission is and how joyful the mission is when we see We don't have to live under the pressure of who's coming to our programmatic expression. We get to live under the joy of investing deeply in a few people who can carry that on.
Amen. Amen. And a lot of the people who watch and listen to this podcast, Will, are in normative sized churches. You know, they're not in the mega churches. So the discouragement for them comes in looking around and comparing their church, their organization, their ministry, their numbers to somebody else's, or their success to somebody else's. So what you're talking about is key. I mean, if you are being faithful to invest in a few, as Jesus has called us to do, then you are doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing.
That's right. And size of your church most of the time is the size of your lower room. I would say the size of your lower room is not the size of your church. It's the size of a ministry opportunity you may or may not be taking advantage of. So, you know, I'd much rather have a lower room, or, you know, an upper room church of 50 people, you know, than a lower room church of 500, right? I mean, what pound for pound, what are we doing to advance God's work in the world? And so, yep. Good,
Amen.
good word.
Well, Will, thank you so much for taking some time and just talking with us and letting other people listen in our conversation. We thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be with you guys.
Well, I know those watching and listening have been encouraged and equipped to better lead in their local church, and I know we have as well. So again, thank you, Will, and we'll see y'all next time.